Hello and welcome back to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever. Today is Monday, January 5th, and it is a great pleasure and honor for us to have as our guest today Jenna Russell, who is the New England Bureau Chief for the New York Times. She covers news across the New England states and also explores how broader national trends play out in the region. Before she went to work for the New York Times, she reported for the Boston Globe for about 20 years and covered several areas, including immigration, education, urban neighborhoods, and mental health care. She's also co-authored two books for the Globe, one about Senator Edward M. Kennedy and the other about the Boston Marathon bombing. Jenna Russell, welcome to GNAT-TV.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here.
We really appreciate you making the time for this conversation. So many interesting things going on in the world today and in New England, of course. But I thought we could start by having you tell us perhaps a little bit about how you got started in the world of journalism. What made you decide that you wanted to be a reporter back in the good old days when you were just starting out?
It seems like a long time ago now, Andrew. But reflecting back, so I was a kid. I grew up in the suburbs north of Boston. I grew up, my dad would get the Boston Globe every morning, obviously in print, very old school, and he would sit down and read through every page of that newspaper. So I was kind of immersed in that atmosphere, and I loved books. I loved reading and writing. I didn't set out to become a journalist so much as I majored in English literature, did a concentration in creative writing, actually wrote a lot of poetry and fiction in college, and then decided to do an internship during college at a small-ish paper in Salem, Massachusetts. And it was one of those very kind of wonderful moments where I walked into this newsroom that was very, very gritty, very old school kind of newsroom with the dirty, smelly carpet and the collection of diverse characters. And they put me on to start at the 6 a.m. shift where I would come in, and it was an afternoon paper, so I would come in and very quickly write a bunch of obituaries for that day's paper. So that was the first thing I ever did, was write obits. And I just immediately knew in my gut that this was the place where I wanted to be. The people, the energy, the kind of quickly moving from one thing to the next. It just felt, it was just, I just knew. And I know everyone is not so fortunate as to have that experience in finding a career, but I did. So I did a couple of internships in that newsroom during college, and then right out of college, started to look for an entry-level job in actually a weekly paper is where I started out covering education, local schools, going to school committee meetings that would last like 3 or 4 hours at a stretch. And I loved it. I loved building these sources and these relationships and coming to understand this one small community, and then kind of built on that as I went forward.
Well, that's fascinating. And it brings back some memories for me as well. What is your sense of where the industry, where journalism and reporting is going? I mean, over the last 20 or so years, we've seen some incredible changes happening to the world of journalism between the internet, social media. It's such a different operation now than it was back when you started, back when I started. I mean, it's just a totally different world. I mean, I often think that someone who had been a news reporter, let's say in the 1950s or 1960s, could have walked into a newsroom in 2000 and would have recognized things. It would have seemed familiar. Someone who had worked in, someone from that time period now coming into a newsroom today with the internet and everything else would be like completely lost. Where do you think the whole ability of the industry to kind of compete, I guess, if that's the word, with social media and other forms of information gathering is headed?
Yeah, it is the important question of our time, I think, in journalism, and it's a big, huge, complicated question. And as someone who did start doing this work in the 1990s and is still doing it now, where so many of the people I started out with have moved out of journalism for a lot of different reasons, it is, I do a lot of thinking back and thinking about where we've been and where we're going. Um, and you're right that so much has changed. And in some ways, it's funny because the work is really, in a lot of ways, it's easier to do because of technology and the internet. And when I started, I still had stacks of phone books on my desk, and this is how we would find people. And now it's just, so much simpler to track down sources and to find experts and data and all of these things. But at the same time, as you allude to, the job has gotten harder in a lot of ways. And part of that is, well documented mistrust of the media and of all, institutions, really, but particularly the media, I think, has borne the brunt of some of this in recent years. And so, I can say from experience, gaining people's trust, drawing people into conversation, convincing people that I'm coming to every story with an open mind and an interest in hearing every viewpoint is harder and harder to do. It is very, very common to, when I go out on, like in an election year, I'll spend quite a bit of time just standing around in supermarket parking lots, talking to voters, approaching strangers, asking people if they'll spend a couple of minutes with me, explaining where they're at. And that has gotten so much harder to do because people just, they, there isn't the same willingness to believe that what we're doing is really sincere and authentic and grounded in that hard work, that shoe leather work of talking to real people out on the street. And even as you're standing before people as living proof that this is really how we're going about it, there's still a reluctance to accept that, or an unwillingness. At the same time, doing that work always reconnects me with people in such a gratifying way. And there are always people who will say, yes, I'll take 5 minutes, let me talk to you about this. And so I think that where things are going, there's every reason to be very concerned. As you mentioned in some of our dialogue leading up to this conversation, the shrinking number of local news outlets is incredibly concerning. I think about it all the time as someone who made their way up through those kinds of newsrooms. It's an indescribable loss. It's that kind of local, on the ground oversight of government is so critical. And when it starts to go away, as it has just in dramatic fashion in recent decades, you can see that there isn't, an empowerment of people in power to do what they will. I will say, though, and I need to say that doing this work in New England, it is incredibly heartening to see how many small, often nonprofit newsrooms have sprung up. Things like the Vermont Digger, which is just doing incredible work every single day. In Maine, I see lots of this happening as well. Very tiny little, sometimes one-person operations, two-people operations. Even where I live in Plymouth, Massachusetts, in the last few years, we've had a guy who retired from the Boston Globe, started something here that has, and I can just see the difference that it makes to have a reporter at local meetings documenting and reporting on what is happening week to week in this community and in communities all over New England. It is making a difference. It is incredibly difficult. This work is so labor intensive. It's so expensive to do, and people don't understand that. It took so long for people to understand why they should have to pay for local news. I think we still hear this, from readers. Why is there a paywall? Why can't I access the story? Why am I, and it's frustrating, and you want to say to people, but how do you think that these reporters are going to get paid? And how is this going to work if people aren't willing to pay for it? So that's a battle that we're still fighting, but I think headway has been made. And I think, if anything, the having some of these papers go away has reawakened a lot of people to the importance of this work and has inspired a lot of people to do the work and to make sure that the work continues to happen. So I feel a mix of deep pessimism and some optimism about, and I hear from students all the time. Almost every week I get an email from a student somewhere who is thinking of going into journalism and wants to talk to me and see what I think. And it's hard to know what to tell them, right? But it thrills me to see that there is still that kind of interest in this work and recognition of its importance.
Absolutely, it truly is very important. As you say, small newspapers are, that's what kind of knits a town together, I think. When there's one source of information for what's happening at the town council and the high school the sports teams, whatever, it really makes a difference when that's not there any longer, no question. So I guess I just wondered, you've covered New England now for a while. What is it about the area that makes it an interesting and distinctive beat for you? I mean, you must enjoy covering the states of the Northeast. What continues to make it fun?
Oh my gosh, at its best, it is so much fun, and I do not think there's anywhere better in the country. Have I reported everywhere in the country? No. This is my home. This is the place I know best. This is really where I have wanted to do this work and feel so fortunate to have been able to do it here for so long. First at the Globe, where I just, it is so hard now for papers to invest in long-term project work because it just takes so much time and money and resource. But the Globe was a place where leadership always understood the importance of doing that work. And I was so lucky to work on so many long-term projects where I was able to really dig in and spend the time to build trust and to do some very human-centered storytelling. And then to be able to continue to do work for the Times, which has been a new and different challenge, here in this region is just like the opportunity of a lifetime. And I think what's great about New England is, I mean, we have big cities to report on. We have all, the fascinating and concerning issues of rural life and rural places that are at risk. I spent time working for the Bangor Daily News in Maine earlier in my career. I went to college in New Hampshire, so spent time in New Hampshire in my career, did a lot of work in Western Massachusetts in my career. And it's just, I do think here, talking to colleagues of mine around the country who work on the national desk at the Times, I think I have the advantage here of having probably a larger proportion of the population that does understand the work that we're doing and the importance of it. I think New England is much more complicated and politically mixed than people elsewhere in the country realize. So one thing I enjoy doing here is kind of opening a window on that and helping people around the country to understand that this isn't just, this liberal blue corner of the country that can be dismissed, and that even in a place like Vermont or in Massachusetts, there is a lot more going on than is obvious. So I enjoy delving into that. I love that we have such an incredible concentration here in New England of higher education institutions, experts in every possible area at a lot of these colleges and universities. I love the history here. I really do gravitate toward writing about some of the tensions between the way things have been done, going back hundreds of years, and the way that things are evolving. So I just find it an endlessly rich place to find great stories to write, and great people, interesting people, fascinating people to write about.
Well, let's dive into a couple of the stories you've written recently. You've been writing several over the last few months, and you wrote many about the recent tragic shooting that took place at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. You filed several stories about that very unfortunate event there. I guess I wondered if you could walk us through what it was like covering that when you first, from the time you first heard about it, and then all the follow-up stories you did on the various aspects of that event.
Sure. Yeah, that is the hardest part of my job for sure, is the breaking news that happens. And as the bureau chief in New England, that is always my responsibility, is to be one of the first people who's responding to those situations. We've been pretty lucky here in New England not to have, a, a lot of that kind of news. But when it happens, it is all consuming. It is very stressful, and you never know when it's going to happen. So one of the things about this job compared to jobs I've had in the past is that, I am not in a position to ever turn my cell phone off. So even when I go to a yoga class at the gym, I always need to be monitoring to make sure, that something isn't happening somewhere in my states that I'm responsible for. And that's, it's a lot of responsibility. So I was at home that Saturday and got a call from an editor very soon after the first reports of the shooting there, and was asked to get to Providence as quickly as possible, which I did. And one incredible thing about the New York Times, just given the number of staff and resources that they have, is that you never feel like you're on your own in these situations. They will instantly mobilize dozens of people who are backing you up, both on the ground and getting there as quick as they can, and also in New York, where people are instantly on the phones, reaching out to people. People are, the research department there is just unparalleled in skill, and will be digging for phone numbers and addresses, of anyone connected to these kind of situations, to help give you the kind of foundation that you need, and the support that you need. They also have such an amazing security operation where you feel, in this case, and also in Lewiston, Maine, after the mass shooting there, you're in a situation where they have not apprehended a suspect. Someone is still out there, and the Times has developed a really sophisticated system of keeping track of staff, photographers and reporters on the ground, making sure that they know where people are, providing you with the latest information that you may not be tracking minute to minute as you're going about your reporting. So you go in there knowing that people have your back, and that's really important. So I was there pretty late that Saturday night, kind of doing what I could to get close to the scene, trying to see how people were responding. At the same time, I'm in my car making calls to, student contacts that I had previously from previous stories, to see what they're seeing and hearing from where they are on campus or close to campus. And we're all just in that moment trying to sort through what is happening. There are always, there's always misinformation that's circulating, and part of your job is to sort through that and make sure that what's being reported is right and as accurate as it can be. So I was prepared to stay there overnight. In the end, I ended up going back home overnight, and then the next day I started working. Typically what we do in those situations is kind of divide staff into different teams, and so there are teams that are working law enforcement at part of the story, there are teams that are working to understand the suspect, there are teams that are working to try and learn more about the victims of the shooting. So I became involved in reporting on the victims primarily, but also backing up colleagues who were doing other parts of this work. So it's for a number of days, it's really totally consuming. It's very long days. It's trying to get what you can and get that information to the people who need it for the stories that they're doing. is very collaborative. These are the moments typically where I get to know my colleagues, who I don't work, who are all over the country. And so I'm not working with them day to day in person. And a lot of times I'm doing stories very much on my own. But at these moments uh, is really when I develop closer relationships with the other people on the national desk at the time. So there's a real value in that comes out of these very difficult situations.
Mm. Well, you wrote several stories about that event. They're all amazing stories. I can't imagine what that must have been like being there for that. Another one I found really interesting, and actually it was the story that first caught my eye and made me think we need to have you on here for a conversation, was the one about the Catholic Church in Dedham, Massachusetts, just a town just outside of Boston, that put up a display opposing the ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement. They had a display there. And I was interesting because I don't think I've ever seen a church anywhere have that kind of a overtly political display in the front. And I gather it must have created a certain amount of controversy locally and probably more than locally. Um, what led you to that story? How did you find out about it?
Well, I mean, I rely so much on other media here in the Boston area. I obviously the first thing I do every day is read the Globe and see what they're talking about. And so I had seen this reported in the Globe, and I was very intrigued by it because, as you said, I mean, it was striking to see a church taking this kind of political stance. And then I was really interested when I learned that this was not the first time that they had done something like this, that in fact it was part of their kind of Christmas tradition was to sort of make a political critique as part of their holiday nativity scene. So I, and this is a good opportunity to talk about what I look for in stories as a Times reporter in New England, as opposed to when I was working for the Globe. So when you're working for the Globe, obviously your job is to tell people in New England as much as you can about what is happening in New England that's newsworthy and interesting. The hardest thing about taking on this new job for me in the last couple of years has been to learn what makes a national story for the New York Times out of New England. And it's a very different way of thinking, a different bar for stories. What you're essentially looking for is a story that is rooted in New England, but either tells people around the country something they might not understand about New England, or it is revealing something that is true nationally, that people relate to elsewhere and say, oh, that's interesting. That seems, familiar to me, or that is revealing something that is happening around the country. So this kind of struck me as both things at once. A story that really kind of opened a window on the Catholic Church here and its diversity and whatever you want to say about that. But also, I felt like this is a moment when people are thinking so much about immigration and about ICE actions in their cities and their towns. And I have sensed here in New England, and I know this is true elsewhere, such an appetite to kind of do something about what feels to many people like an injustice. And I think I have seen people struggle for what they can do as an average everyday person. And so I just thought this is a really unexpected way that people are responding to something that's going on around the country that they feel strongly about. And I just thought this, sometimes it's just a gut feeling, as you know, that the story will resonate for readers, that they will be interested in this. And I ended up doing the story more quickly than I had intended because just as I was launching my reporting, I learned uh, that there was a meeting plan between the church leaders and the archdiocese, and that there might be some resolution to come out of this that might cause them to take down their display. And I thought, well, I need to do this very quickly then, because the moment will have passed if I take more than a day or so to do the story. So I did the story in about a day. drove to Dedham, spent some time there at the church, and talked to people in the neighborhood. And actually, being honest, I would have loved to do something a little more textured and a little deeper to understand this church, and the pastor at the head of it, and also to put it in a little more context around what has happened in the Catholic Church in the last 20 years in Massachusetts, which is obviously, as you know, as everyone knows, a huge story, one that I witnessed close up unfolding at the Globe, and that I've always, been really interested in. But, this is the nature of daily journalism. There really wasn't time to do that. So I did the quicker, shorter version of the story. And it turned out that was enough to really engage readers. It was a very well-read piece. It turned out that there were a few other churches around the country that reached out to me and said, we've done something similar here. It seemed to tap into something. And so that is one kind of story that you end up doing. You do it very quickly. It resonates. I think it's successful in one way. There's another version of that story, right, that I could have spent a week on, and it would have been a different story. But you have to kind of adapt to the moment that you're in.
Absolutely. So another story you've reported on recently, and I couldn't help but want to ask you about it, was the flooding that has taken place in Vermont last couple of years, amazingly on the same date in July. So FEMA is I guess, going to be hopefully helping out the state, but I guess I just wondered, are there any plans that you have for like doing a follow-up on that, or what do you think we should be continuing to be watching for on that whole subject?
I do. It's interesting that you say that, because I've had this conversation with my editor a couple of times about what we should be doing as follow-ups to that story, which was that was really was affecting to go and see these places, downtown Montpelier, underwater in that way. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen in my reporting career before, and it really stayed with me. And I just feel so strongly that this just feels like a very urgent area to explore with more stories, because you can't help but feel, after that pattern of repetition that you referenced, that we will see this happening again. And I am very interested I think we don't do enough of follow-up and, sticking with stories. It's a hard thing to do in a news cycle like the one that we're in right now in particular. But I think it's so important to stay with a story like that, to see what the state of Vermont is doing differently or trying to do differently to protect and prevent and prepare for these kind of worst case scenarios. And I, as one person covering 5 states, I'm obviously stretched in a million different directions. But I think when there's something like that, it's a thread that you need to do your damnedest to hang on to and follow. And I would like to do some reporting. I had some people reach out to me about their struggles with FEMA to get, money that they were due to replace or repair housing and businesses. And I am not, to be honest, up to speed on the status of what's happening with that. And I think it's something that I'd like to revisit this year if I can.
Yeah, the emphasis certainly seems to be on building resilience, so that the next time there is a flood or a weather event like that, that there won't be quite as much damage, or homes destroyed, or roads washed out, or whatever. I mean, because it has been interesting to see the kind of the after effects of all of that, particularly in the housing area, which has been a big issue here in the state. There's a shortage of housing to start with, and every time you have a major flood like that and more homes are destroyed, that's just making the problem even more harder to
Right,
fix.
right, exactly. And people are displaced and they don't end up with anywhere they can go because the cost of housing has. I do think the housing story in New England is probably the number one story in the region right now, as far as how it is affecting every aspect of people's lives, from
Yeah.
where they decide to live to what jobs they can do. And it's a hard thing to write about in some ways because you want to be proactive in the sense that you're writing about um, solutions, and there are things that are happening that are, you know, people are trying to address this issue. So another thing I hope to do this year is find ways to write about um, innovative solutions that are being tried in different places around New England.
Well, one last story I just wanted to ask you about before we need to run here is a subject I've been kind of interested in myself, and that's small towns that are sort of struggling to kind of survive, if that's the right word, as the population ages and shrinks. You know, businesses have a harder time staying in business. I mean, it's certainly not a phenomenon that's unique to New England. I'm sure you could go across many parts of the country, Appalachia, out in the West, where you'd see the same phenomenon in play, where small rural communities that used to have, let's say, a factory or some kind of major employer that closed or moved to someplace else, and younger folks are finding more job opportunities in cities and urban areas. Um, I guess I'm just wondering, do you have any plans to write any future stories on that subject, or how do you kind of look at that whole situation?
I agree. I think it's incredibly interesting what is happening in some of these far rural places. And I am planning to do a little reporting. I'm intrigued by a phenomenon I see happening in Maine, where there are a number of towns right now, really tiny towns, that are taking votes to kind of deorganize and actually go from being a town to not being a town anymore because they don't have the critical mass of population of people to get involved and to run the town and to be engaged in government. Um, and that is striking. It feels like something unraveling that you want to get at the core of that and understand it. I'm really interested in rural healthcare too, and what is happening with some of these tiny hospitals that simply cannot keep going way up in northern Maine, northern Vermont, northern New Hampshire, and how far can we expect people to go for their health care? Same thing with schools, just schools that have to close because there aren't any kids anymore because young families can't afford housing, they can't afford to be there, and there are no jobs for them. So I talked to some folks recently who just put it in a very stark way that really stayed with me, saying, 30 years from now, this is going to look very differently. And some of these rural places are probably not going to be there anymore. And it's a little bit like the opposite of the story you expect to tell about what's happening in the country. But I think looking closely into these corners that don't get a lot of coverage, there's really a lot to be learned about what this country is going to look like down the road. And it's honestly it's tied to politics too. What is happening in rural places is important in the way that it shapes people's views of what we need and what we need as leaders in the country. And I think trying to dig deep into that and connect those things is important work.
It's a subject that's so fascinating to me because I, when I was finishing college at the University of Vermont more than a couple of decades ago, it was almost like the opposite seemed to be going on. You seem to have a lot of people moving out of cities to get back to the land and wanted to live in a rural country kind of environment because it was a simpler kind of lifestyle and it was just more attractive. And it's just interesting to see how that has changed so much. I mean, I don't know if that moment was kind of bit of a difference in, like, sort of, if you wanted to look at broad arc of history over the past 100 or 200 years, you could say, well, it's always been a case where people have been moving to cities. That's where the jobs were. But it was just interesting that there was a time not so long ago when living in the country seemed like the cool thing to do, and it was very attractive to people.
It's totally true, and also intriguing, I think, to look at that moment of the pandemic 5 or 6 years ago, where you had a little bit of a resurgence of that, right? But it was people who could work from home, who had that privilege of mobility, who could go and buy a place, by the lake in Vermont and set up shop there and start spending a chunk of their time there. And that, of course, has been a huge factor in the inflation of real estate prices. So it's like the concern that I hear is that some of these places will become, they'll become a place you can be if you have certain means and resources, but for everyone else, it's not going to be possible to stay there. So what does that look like then in a lot of New England that is, beautiful places that could really be, there's just, you feel the potential for a really dramatic change in what these places are and who lives there.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll have to wait and see how that all evolves. Hopefully there will be some good balance struck between it all that will enable those rural areas to kind of survive and prosper in some way or another. Well, I guess we'll have to leave it there for today, unfortunately, in my opinion. This is a conversation I'd really enjoy continuing with. But Jenna Russell, the New England Bureau Chief of the New York Times, thank you very much for being with us today and sharing your insights on your reporting. It must be fascinating work.
It's great work. I'm still really lucky to be able to do it, and I so appreciate the opportunity to talk about the work a little bit with you. So thank you for having me.
It's been our pleasure. Thank you very much.
Take care. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Okay, well, thanks to all of you who shared part of your day with us. I appreciate that, and we'll see you again the next time. Meanwhile, take care.